Hello and welcome back. This is the week 14 lecture. So we are down to the final 2 weeks of instruction, basically the last 2 weeks of class. We're not really going to use exam week, which would be week 16, because we don't have an exam. The final draft of the research paper will be due at the end of week 15, at the end of next week. So we really only have 2 weeks left. So it's important that we are really moving on our research papers by this point. So we've already accomplished a lot. Hopefully, by the time you're watching this, you have already finished the final version of the annotated bibliography. You've already finished an outline for the research paper, and you've also conferenced with me. Most of you have. So once we've done all of those things, we are ready to move into drafting, creating a rough draft of the research paper, and that's really all we're doing this week. We are committing this entire week to drafting. Drafting is its own stage of the writing process. So I want to talk a little bit more about what drafting means, what all goes into it, and how is it different from what we've been doing up until this point. So I've talked about the writing process a few times by now, and I think we're generally familiar with the three major stages of the writing process. We have pre-writing at the beginning, then we have drafting, and then at the end, we have post-writing. So within each one of those major stages, you have several individual steps or actions that you need to complete. So up until now, we've only been doing pre-writing. That's all we've been doing, really, for several weeks, going back to pretty early in the semester. So pre-writing means everything that you do before you actually write the paper. So as we've seen, there's a lot to do before we actually sit down to write. So pre-writing includes stuff like research. We've been looking for sources going all the way back to week 5. That's a part of it. Researching, learning more about your topic, and finding sources that you can later use on the research paper. Also, brainstorming, all of that idea generation stuff that we started on around week 10. All of that was part of pre-writing, right? We were generating ideas. We were coming up with potential claims. We were writing down those ideas and claims. And then later, we started adding reasons and evidence to those claims. So all of that was really idea generation. We were writing, but we weren't necessarily writing a paper. We were often writing individual claims, and then we would add more to those claims. So in some cases, we were ending up with multiple sentences per claim, or maybe a short paragraph per claim. But that's not quite the same as writing a paper. We're still brainstorming, we're still generating ideas, and we were really focused on developing claims. But our other focus, of course, was on our research. So you guys have to remember, we spent all of those weeks researching. We did the lit review, which was basically just a chance to summarize and paraphrase and quote our sources. So by now, I'm expecting that we all have a pretty good base of knowledge about our topics. We have our research done because the bibliographies should be finished by now. But also, you've picked things up from your research and your reading. You have your own base of knowledge. And of course, you're going to be using your sources a lot on the research paper. But all of that research and then all of the claim development that we've been doing over the last few weeks, all of that was part of pre-writing, right? Those were just sort of different steps of the pre-writing stage. And really, the last thing that we did, the last couple of things that we did for pre-writing was the proposal. So pitching your argument to me, that was also part of pre-writing. Again, you were writing, but not really a paper. You wrote a proposal, something very short, an elevator pitch. That was the style we used for Research Journal 9. But you were just proposing your argument, pitching it to me like a product so I could sign off on your thesis. That was also a part of pre-writing. And then finally, the outline. Hopefully that's the most recent thing that we've done, or one of the most recent things. And that's usually the last major step of pre-writing, because as we've said, the outline is a plan for your paper. So before you start writing, you want to have that plan in place. So once you've outlined and once you've finished your research, that usually means you can close the door on pre-writing and you can move into the next stage of the writing process, and that is drafting. Also sometimes referred to as composing. Just other words for the act of writing. Now we are ready to write the paper. So we move into the writing stage this week. And like I said, week 14 is devoted to drafting. We want to create a completed draft of the research paper. That is really our only goal for this week. But it's a big goal because this is a big paper. So I've made the assignment links available in the week 14 module so you can see we have two separate submissions that we will be doing eventually. We have a rough draft submission that's due at the end of this week, and then you have the final draft submission, which is due at the end of week 15, and that's our final assignment. So if you want the assignment details, all of the instructions, all of the rules, all of the things you must follow, look in the final draft link. I didn't bother to repeat the directions. The rough draft is obviously the same directions, the same basic format and content as the final draft. So make sure you're clear on all of the requirements and remind yourself again of the due dates, but they're pretty easy to remember. We're keeping everything the same. That both drafts will be due at the end of a week. Rough draft due at the end of this week, final draft due at the end of week 15. If you need an extension on that final draft, we can probably work something out, but really we're not going to need much of exam week because, like I said, we're turning everything in by the end of our final week of instruction, and that's week 15. So let's talk a little bit about what it means to draft. Usually when I tell students that drafting or composing are just other words for writing, they're like, oh, okay, so this is the last part. We've done all of the pre-writing, now I'm just writing. So I'm going to churn out a paper over the next day or two. Maybe I'll look over it once, and then I submit. A lot of students think once you start writing, you've kind of reached the end of the writing process, but of course, that's not true. Because drafting can sometimes be a pretty time-consuming stage of the process. It just depends on where you are, how comfortable you are with the argument that you're making, the content that you're discussing. Sometimes we have to write more than one rough draft. So what is a rough draft? The term is very broad. It refers to any draft that comes before the final draft. So I know we know the differences between these terms, but let's just spend a moment really thinking about these. So the final draft is what you turn in for the final grade on the research paper. It is the single biggest grade of the class, of the semester. So, of course, the name says it all. It is final. So it must be polished. It must be your best work. Okay, there's no more time to revise. And because it's the end of the semester, you can't resubmit. You can't try again. And that we have been able to resubmit some of our previous assignments. We have been able to revisit old work, make necessary changes, and then turn them in again for a new grade. But I can't do that with the final draft because it's the end of the semester and I need to go ahead and grade them. And by the time I've graded them, grades are due and we're completely finished with the spring semester. So it's final. That means it has to be polished, correct, clear, It has to be everything that you want it to be. So we know that, I think, sort of instinctively, but we don't always think about it a lot. The final draft needs to be polished and somewhat professional looking and sounding. It needs to meet all of the standards of academic writing, college writing. So it's a pretty high bar to meet with the final draft. That's why we take so long to get there. It takes a long time for you to be ready to submit a polished final draft. So we're not ready yet. Nobody should be turning in a final draft this week. And if anyone does, I'm going to tell you to resubmit because I don't want you to be early, at least not this early. Let's do a rough draft first. I will then provide feedback on those rough drafts, and then you can tackle the final draft later in week 15. Okay, so in some cases, we might write one rough draft, and then we're going to revise, and then we're going to edit, and once we've revised and edited, the new draft might be good enough to be a final draft. This is sort of best case scenario. We do one rough draft, then we embark on post-writing, which we'll talk about next week. We revise, we edit, we make the necessary changes, and basically the process of post-writing will convert a rough draft into a final draft, if everything goes well. If that rough draft was already in pretty good shape, and then you revised and edited exactly like you needed to, now you probably do have a good final draft that you can submit. We would all like it to work that way and to be that easy and straightforward, but it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes the first draft we write, the initial rough draft, is just not very good. Okay, you have to be aware of this. This is part of what we mean when we say writing is a process. And you shouldn't be discouraged or upset if your rough draft has a lot of flaws, if it has a lot of things that need fixing. That's kind of how it's supposed to be. Rough drafts are rough. They are not final. They are not polished. They are not quite where you want them to be. That's what makes them rough. That's what makes them not ready to be submitted as a final draft. So, of course, you guys can imagine, I often see a lot of final drafts that are really rough drafts. The students might not have realized it, but what they have turned into me is a rough draft. It has some good ideas, maybe the argument is pretty good, but it's rough. There are too many mistakes. There's a lack of clarity at times. Maybe the sources have not been smoothly integrated. Maybe the quote sandwiches aren't very good. Maybe the policy isn't working yet. Maybe they're a body paragraph or two short of the minimum length requirement. That's common in a rough draft. Maybe it's just a lack of polish, some unclear sentences, some kind of surface level mistakes, maybe a few missing in-text citations, nothing that can't easily be fixed, but the problem is they're submitting that draft as a final draft at the very end of the semester, so there's no more time to revise or edit. So every mistake that's in that rough draft, is going to be noticed and noted by me. That's going to cause your grade to go down. So even if the content is good, and often the content will be good, the arguments are good, but the draft is actually a rough draft. It's not a final draft. It's not polished enough. It's not clear enough. It's not smooth enough to really qualify as a final draft. So that often ends up hurting people's grades. So it's just important to keep in mind the difference. A rough draft is something that you will continue to work on. It is something you will continue to work with. It's not ready to submit to me for a final grade. Now, you will turn in rough drafts, but then I will give you feedback so you can revise and edit those rough drafts. So like I said, for some people, one rough draft is enough. After they've produced that rough draft, they can make the necessary revisions and edits to improve the paper, and then they're ready to turn in the final draft. But in other cases, it takes more than one rough draft. Maybe your first rough draft is just kind of a mess. There's some good stuff in there, but you're still a ways away from where you want to be. So then you write another draft, a better draft, but it's still rough. It's a lot better. You've maybe made some important additions. You've made some important improvements. And keep in mind, you're not starting from scratch, right? Once you've produced that initial rough draft, you don't have to then write a brand new draft starting with a brand new opening sentence. You can work with a lot of what you already have, right? That is really post-writing, what we're going to be talking about next week. You're going to start revising. You're going to start changing what's there. Maybe you'll add more to it. Maybe you'll take stuff out. Maybe you will end up rewriting parts of it. Maybe you'll decide, whoa, this body paragraph's not really working. Let me just try again. But in other cases, there's good content. So you're adding to it, you're clarifying it. Maybe you have a good claim and one body paragraph, but not enough evidence. So you have to go back, you have to make some additions, make some changes, but you're not starting from scratch. But you might have to keep working with that draft. And as you make changes, you're going to keep producing new drafts, new versions of that original rough draft. So maybe the second version, it's better, but you still have a ways to go. So you end up with a third version, and it's good. You feel comfortable sending that one in to me as your rough draft. And then I give you feedback, some additional changes you need to make. You do that. So by the time you're submitting the final draft, it might be your third or fourth overall draft. But that's fine. That's often how it goes, even for professional writers. A lot of professional writers have to do multiple drafts of an article or a book, whatever it is that they're writing, before it's ready to be published, before it is fit for public consumption. It just takes a long time. It takes a long time to get everything where you want it. Now, for some people, it might take a little less time. For other people, it might take a little more time. There's not one size that fits all. Everybody drafts and does post-writing a little bit differently, just like everybody did pre-writing a little bit differently. So you have to be a little bit patient when it comes to drafting. But the first step in this stage is always to produce a finished draft. See, too often students are content to stop halfway through. They'll write 3 or 4 pages, there'll be some good content, but then they'll stop. And they'll say, okay, this is my rough draft. I know I have to write more, but this is my rough draft. And I'll tell them, well, it's the first half of your rough draft. Because a rough draft really needs to be complete. It doesn't have to be a finished product. It's going to be rough in many ways, but it needs to be complete. Because if it's not complete, it's harder to work with it. It's harder to see what you really have and what you really need to do. So I always tell people at this beginning of the drafting stage, just focus on producing a completed rough draft. Okay, completion is more important at this point than almost anything else. Try to meet the length requirement and try to execute the complete plan that you laid out in your outline. So another thing to remember, when you sit down to start writing this week, when you sit down to start working on that initial rough draft, have your outline handy. Have the outline pulled up on a screen or sitting next to you if you did it by hand, but you need to be looking at the outline. Now, you can make some changes to the plan. Don't feel like you are married to every single thing in the outline. You can make some changes as you go, but it's nice to start with the plan. Take a look at what you're supposed to be doing in each paragraph and try to do all of those things as best you can. If the outline is good, it should give you a really nice jump start on drafting. If you already know what you're going to cover in each body paragraph, what's the claim in this body paragraph? What's my big claim in the next body paragraph? If you know the reasons and the evidence that you're going to use to support those claims, then you can really just start writing almost immediately because you know exactly what you're doing. You can go back to the appropriate source if you have those notes in the outline. Go back to this article, get the quote on this page. So you can just start plugging that stuff in. You can start actually writing everything that you planned in the outline. Now, sometimes we find that our plan in the outline was not quite adequate. Maybe we didn't plan quite enough body paragraphs, or maybe we thought we did, but it turns out a couple of those body paragraphs got combined into one paragraph, and maybe we didn't have quite as much to say about our third and fourth supporting claims. So we followed the plan, but we're still maybe a little bit short on content. That's not a big deal as long as you discover that early this week. You want to discover that before the rough draft is due. You want to discover that, hey, I need another body paragraph, or I need to do more of a policy paragraph. You want to see that, around the middle of the week, probably at the latest, so you still have some time to write a little bit more before the rough draft is due. So the outline's a great place to start, but sometimes we will deviate a little bit from the path that we laid out in that outline. We can even decide, you know what, I don't want to write that body paragraph. I'm going to do a different body paragraph. That's fine. You can make those decisions once you start drafting. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the way to approach a rough draft. Everybody has their own writing style and their own writing procedure. So I want everybody to kind of do what's comfortable for them. Get yourself in the kind of space with the kind of surroundings that you like when you're writing. It's good to be comfortable both mentally and physically. But there's some other things to keep in mind as you start drafting. So like I said, focus on completion and try to get into a sort of flow state. I'm sure we've probably heard of this term before. You can Google it and get a pretty good AI definition. Here's the one that I found for flow state. It is a psychological state of deep engagement and focus. So that's really what I want us to strive for. Deep engagement and focus. And if you read on about the flow state, you'll see that you're supposed to be free of distractions and self-consciousness when you enter into a flow state. So why is that important? Well, writing is hard, and writing takes time. And if you're going to write a long paper, you need to sort of get into the zone. That might be how we sort of refer to a flow state more colloquially, using more common language. You're in the zone. You're not thinking about anything else. You're just flowing. The ideas are flowing. The writing is flowing. And in order to achieve this, you have to almost like step outside of yourself a little bit. A lot of us are very self-conscious writers. And I understand. I've been there. I know the feeling. And I can sometimes feel that way too. We can sometimes be very critical of our own writing. Oh, I don't like the way that sentence sounds. I don't really know how to put this particular idea. And we can struggle and we can get sort of hung up on the minor mistakes that occur when we write. Or we start scrutinizing every single sentence. Oh, that sounds bad. That sounds stupid. I don't like that. And see, when you're doing that, you are not in a flow state, right? You are not deeply focused and engaged. Instead, you're getting increasingly frustrated. And you don't like anything that you've written. But most importantly, you're slowing yourself down. That's what I want you guys to think about. When you're beating yourself up for every sentence that you write, you're not actually writing. You're going back and erasing sentences, or you're going back and trying to revise sentences that you've already written. Remember, revision means you're improving what you've already written. But we're not revising yet. We don't revise until we have a completed rough draft, at least one. So we're not ready to revise yet. We're not going to do that until next week after we've drafted. So don't worry so much about mistakes. Not when you're working on a rough draft. I want to be clear. You should worry about mistakes and clarity on the final draft. But the rough draft is different. Okay? Especially this initial version that you're producing. We already know it's going to be rough. We already know that you're going to need to revise it. So if there's a few sentences that don't sound great, or if you have a couple of sentence fragments or other like grammatical or mechanical errors, it's not a big deal on a rough draft. We're going to have plenty of time to go back and revise and edit so we can clean up and eliminate those mistakes and those rough patches later. Okay, don't worry about it right now. For now, get into that flow state and just start writing. Take all of your ideas, all of the stuff on your outline, all of the stuff that you want to say, and just get it down on paper. Don't worry so much about the style, the correctness, or how good it looks or sounds. We have time for all of that later. So try to get away from that self-consciousness. Don't beat yourself up. Just keep writing. Yeah, there's going to be some stuff you don't like, but you'll fix it later. Okay, for now, focus on getting everything down on paper. Every paragraph you planned. Every source that you're going to use. Every single element of your argument that you want to cover. Again, look back on my sample outline. Look back at your outline before you finish drafting. Have you done everything that you're supposed to do? Have you written all the paragraphs that you plan to write? Look at my sample outline. Are you doing all of the bullet points that I was including for each paragraph? Have you checked all of those boxes? Those are the main things we're worried about with the rough draft. We're really focused on content, getting everything down, and completing the draft. Everything else can wait. So try to free yourself of distractions as well. If you're sitting down to write and it's very loud, or there's a lot going on around you, or you're just doing like 5 or 6 other things, again, you're not going to be able to get into the flow state because you're going to stop writing every 5 minutes to go and do something else. So you're never going to really be focused on the draft. So try to block out an hour, maybe 2 hours. You don't have to write the whole draft in a single sitting. That's another mistake students make sometimes. It's like, oh, the rough draft is due this week. Okay, so I guess I'll sit down on Sunday and I'll write it because I have to submit it by midnight on Sunday. I would give yourself more time than that. That's not a great approach. I mean, I know we're busy. Sometimes we might only have 1 or 2 days at our disposal, but try to give yourself multiple writing blocks. Okay? That's another part of getting ready to draft that I've kind of forgotten to mention. Along with outlining, we often make a writing schedule. That's also one of the last pre-writing steps. You're getting ready to draft, so think about when you're going to have time to sit down and devote, your energy, your attention to the rough draft. So maybe an hour on Tuesday, 2 hours on Thursday, and another hour on Sunday. That can probably get you there. But 1 hour on Sunday night will probably not get you there. So try to block off a few different writing blocks, as many as possible. You guys know your schedules. I do not. So find time, make a schedule, a writing schedule, and try to stick to it. So if you've devoted 2 hours to writing, just don't do anything else during those 2 hours. Just write. Now, of course, you can go to the restroom, get a glass of water, take a break, stretch, but keep your mind focused for those 2 hours or that 1 hour or even a half hour, if that's all the time you can spare. But for that entire block of time, keep your mind focused on the paper. And once that block of time is over, you can get back to all the other things that you're doing. So a true flow state will be free of distractions, free of self-consciousness. So there's no required amount of time, but I would say anything less than a half hour isn't enough time for a single writing block. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, you're not getting much done, right? So at least a half hour, maybe as much as 2 or 3 hours, and find a few of those blocks throughout the week. That way, it's just going to be more manageable. So like I said, don't worry a ton about grammar, mechanics, or overall tone or style. We'll address all of that in week 15 when we revise and edit. Don't get hung up on mistakes, and don't get hung up on every single sentence that you write. Be a little bit generous and gracious with yourself, okay? Acknowledge that there's stuff you're going to have to improve, but that's just part of the process. Just keep writing. Keep going. All right? Now, the one thing that we should go ahead and include, something that we are going to worry about now and later with the final draft, will be our citations. So I will strongly recommend that you go ahead and include your in-text citations in the body of your paper, and you should go ahead and probably have a works cited page at the end of the paper, even for your rough draft. Because if you have issues with your citations and I see those issues on the rough draft, I'll be able to help you fix them. And you'll be able to address those issues before the final draft is due. So let's not wait on the citations. I have seen this a lot. Many students want to wait. And they'll say, well, it's just my rough draft. So yeah, I don't have any in-text citations, but don't worry, I'm going to add them later. As you guys can imagine, that often doesn't work out great. Not because they don't have the best intentions, but because it's hard to go back and add all of your in-text citations at the last minute. It's hard to do that when you're revising and editing. You're going to have to go back to your sources. You're going to have to really repeat a lot of the work that you've already done. You're going to have to go back and sort of figure out, wait, what am I summarizing here? Who am I quoting here? It can get very confusing. And it can be very difficult to do all of that citation work after the fact. This is a long paper, right? You have at least 8 sources. So you don't want to be scrambling to do all of your in-text citations or even the works cited page at the last minute. You want to get that stuff done as early as possible so you're not worrying about it later. So that's the nice thing about having already submitted the annotated bibliography. If your citations there are correct and you're sticking with those same sources on the research paper, well, a lot of your works cited page is probably already done. If the citations are in good shape, you can just cut and paste them onto the works cited page. Now remember, the works cited page is not the same as the bibliography, so I don't want annotations on the works cited page. I just want citations. But if yours are correct, cut and paste them or just copy them to the new works cited page. You don't have to redo those if they are correct. Now, if you've added a couple more sources since the bibliography, then you can add those citations to the works cited page. But for most of us, we don't have to do that much work to create the works cited page. We've already been working with our sources for a long time. We mostly have these citations done, and if we need to do a couple more citations, that won't take long. Remember, like I've said many times, this is one of those things that we can use AI for. Okay, generating MLA works cited citations. You don't need to write those yourselves. There are plenty of good citation generators online, including the one that comes with EBSCO. So if you're using EBSCO through the GBC library, EBSCO will do all of your citations for you. And they will all be correct as long as you choose the proper citation style, which is MLA 9th edition, the most recent version of MLA. That's the citation style we use in most English classes. So let's go ahead and get those citations into the rough draft. So that means, again, the works cited page at the end of the paper, but also the in-text citations in the body of the paper. I would say it's even more important to get those in, because it's really hard to go back and add all of those later. So remember, whenever you are summarizing, paraphrasing, or quoting info from your sources in the body of your paper, you need to have in-text citations showing us where the info comes from. And that's true whether you're quoting or summarizing. We all kind of get that we need to do this when we're quoting. But remember, even if you're just summarizing or paraphrasing a source, you still need an in-text citation to show that the information doesn't come from you, it comes from the source, right? The words are yours if it's a summary, so you're not quoting anything, but the info that you are summarizing, that's not yours, that belongs to the source. So after you've summarized the info, you have to have that in-text citation in parentheses telling us where it came from. So as you're writing, as you are using your sources, go ahead and add the appropriate and necessary in-text citations. We don't want to wait on that. Okay, so a few other things to remember as you start working on your rough drafts. Thesis, thesis, thesis. Okay, by now I've talked with most of you about your arguments. Everybody who conferenced with me has an argument. We haven't always expressed the argument in writing. Many of you expressed them to me in speech. But make sure that you have a clear and strong thesis statement in your rough draft. And of course, that thesis will be near the end of the intro paragraph. Make sure it's there. It doesn't have to sound 100% the way you want it, but it needs to be there. I want to see it. I want to be able to evaluate how it's working in the rough draft. And if we need to make a few changes, a few tweaks to it, we'll have time to do that before the final draft. But it has to be there. If it's not there at all in the rough draft, I can't help you much, because I don't really know what you're trying to do. So the thesis is the centerpiece. That is your overall argument. So make sure it's clear and make sure it encompasses everything that you're going to be doing in your body paragraphs. Okay? And then when we get down to the bodies, make sure you have enough and make sure they are well developed and unified. What I mean by unified is that every body paragraph that you write should accomplish something. Everything in that body should be working together to accomplish something. And what you're accomplishing is sort of the support of the claim that you are making in that paragraph. So remember how we're building most of these body paragraphs. We start by announcing the claim that we're going to be talking about in that paragraph. Then we follow up on that topic sentence. Then we get into some reasons. We get into evidence, often coming from our sources. We follow up on that evidence. Maybe we talk a little bit more ourselves. Maybe we bring in some more evidence. That's what we're doing in these bodies. So you have to make sure that what you start out trying to accomplish at the beginning of the body, the claim that you announce, what you're trying to say about that claim, make sure you've accomplished all that by the end of the body. That's what we mean by unity. The whole body paragraph is working together. The claim, the reasons, the evidence, the stuff that you're saying, the stuff the sources are saying, it all works together. It all adds up to something, right? You're proving that claim. You're supporting that claim. You're making it work, and then you're going to move on to the next claim. So keep that in mind as you're writing body paragraphs. Like I've said in the past, sometimes we might view paragraphs as just kind of happening at random. Like I write, and eventually I start a new paragraph. And then I write some more. I'm still writing. Wow, this is a long paragraph. I'll go ahead and break it and start a new paragraph. And okay, I'm going to write. That's okay for that initial draft, but eventually we want to make sure all of our paragraphs are clear, unified, well-developed, and working well. And of course, they're all working together to support the thesis. So paragraphs don't happen at random. Paragraphs are planned. paragraphs should be thought out. And that's really what the outline is helping with. So even if you're in that flow state and you're just focused on your argument, you're focused on writing, again, it's okay if sometimes you forget to break a paragraph and you end up with a really long paragraph. You can always make that change later. But if you're really following your outline, you should have a pretty good sense of where one paragraph ends, and then where it should end, and then where the next paragraph should probably begin. So you should have a sense of that, okay? I'm doing blank in this body paragraph. In the next body paragraph, I'm doing blank. In the third body paragraph, I'm doing X. The next one, I'm doing Y and Z. Again, if that's just a matter of the claims, I'm doing claim A, claim B, claim C, whatever those are for you, that's fine. In other cases, you might have a little bit more of a complex organization. You might tackle multiple claims in the same body paragraph. You might have one claim that deserves more space, so you devote multiple body paragraphs to one of your big claims. That's fine too. It's up to you. But you need to have a plan, and you need to try to follow that plan as you're writing the paragraphs. And remember, length matters. Like a really short body paragraph isn't always very effective. I mean, you can have some that are relatively short, but if it's only 3 or 4 sentences, how much are you really proving there, right? And remember my body paragraph format. There's a lot to do, right? You have a topic sentence. You follow up on the topic sentence. You offer a reason. You offer evidence. You say something about the reasons and evidence. I mean, at bare minimum, you're going to be looking at maybe 5 sentences for a good, well-developed body paragraph where you're kind of checking all the boxes. You introduce a claim. You support that claim. You say something original. That takes a minute. You can't really do all of that in just a couple of sentences, right? So that's what we mean by development. It's just like humans, right? You want kids to be, to develop well. That means they grow, they're healthy, they can do all the things they want to do. Some paragraphs in these papers are sickly. They seem under the weather. They're not very strong. They're not very able-bodied. They're struggling to get anything done, right? We want our body paragraphs to be healthy, well-developed, unified. You want your reader to know what's been accomplished in that paragraph by the time they get to the end of the paragraph, and then they're ready for the next paragraph. So again, some paragraphs will bleed right into the next one if you're going to continue to talk about the same claim, but you always need some kind of transition, some kind of connecting tissue from one paragraph to the next. Now, some of that you can write now, and then some of that we can add later when we're revising and editing. One common characteristic of a rough draft will be sort of a lack of transitions, and it's kind of often a very rough and choppy sort of move from one paragraph to the next. We can always address that later, but it's nice to try to work in some degree of integration, linkage, smoothness as we go from one paragraph to the next. Also, don't forget about your policy. At some point, you have to develop your policy. That is your plan. That is your set of recommendations, like your solutions to the problem that you've identified. The issue that you are arguing about, here's what we can do. Here's what we can do about it to fix it, to make it better, or whatever. So like I've said, it's up to you how you want to express the policy. A lot of people will have a policy paragraph, which comes near the end of the bodies. And that's where they pretty much lay out the policy in some detail. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to have everything figured out. But it needs to be a pretty comprehensive, well-reasoned, detailed plan. All right? So you might devote a paragraph to that, or as I've said to some of you before, some of our arguments will be what's called sort of policy-based, meaning your argument kind of is your plan, or at least that's a big part of your argument, is sort of recommending that we do certain things, change certain things. Remember, the policy really addresses your readers. It's really what you want your readers to do. Changes that you might want them to make, just a new way of thinking that you might want them to adopt, whatever it is. But it's usually directed at your audience. So here's what I want you guys to do next. That might get incorporated into a lot of your body paragraphs, your regular body paragraphs. So if that's the case, you might just be able to summarize the policy briefly in your conclusion. Like I said, sometimes we can just kind of wrap up the policy as we're concluding the paper in that conclusion paragraph. If that works for you, that's fine. It's really a decision for you to make. And hopefully you thought about it a little bit when you were outlining. But you can try out a few different strategies as you're writing. You might go ahead and write a policy paragraph just in case you need it, and then later you might decide, I actually don't need it. I've already made it clear earlier, and I'm just kind of repeating it all in this policy paragraph. So maybe you cut that paragraph later when you're revising. That's fine. Never hurts to have a little bit more content than you need, right? So the goal, of course, for the rough draft is to make the 7-page minimum length requirement, and that 7 pages not counting the works cited page. But it's never a bad thing to go a little bit beyond 7 pages, because often when we revise, we'll cut stuff. Sometimes we're going to find content in the rough draft that's not working super well. A paragraph that we don't really need, some fluff, some summary that's maybe just a little bit too much, and sometimes we cut it. And we want to be able to cut the unnecessary stuff without affecting our length requirement. So if you have 7.5 pages or close to 8, that gives you a little bit more cushion. If you just barely have 7, well, you better hope all that content works, because if you have some stuff that needs to go, or at least needs to be reworked extensively, then you might have a little bit more writing to do. You know, you might have to write a little bit more before you're ready to really produce a final draft. But it all depends. Everybody's paper is a little bit different. Everybody's approach will be a little bit different, but these are just some things to make sure you're doing, some things to look for. Make sure you have a thesis you feel good about, make sure you have body paragraphs that you feel good about, and make sure you have a policy. Another thing to remember is responding to our opponents. So I've mentioned this a few times, but now that we're ready to write, I want to make sure we're actually doing this somewhere in our body paragraphs. And you can do this in a lot of different ways. Some people might do this a lot. Other people might only do it once or twice, but you need to do it at least a little bit. Respond to the other side. This is important. It's important for your credibility. So when we talk about the artistic appeals and how we can incorporate those, remember, artistic appeals like pathos, that's emotion, ethos, that's credibility, and then logos or logic, we generally create the artistic appeals ourselves, right? That's why they are the artistic appeals. The author, which means you guys, the authors will create those. You'll come up with those yourself. So one way to really strengthen your credibility and to make a good ethical appeal is to be able to respond to the other side. You want to show that you've done your homework and you know what your opponents have to say. This also makes it clear that you really are being argumentative. Because if you're argumentative, that means you have taken a side in an ongoing debate. And if you're on one side of that debate, that means there has to be somebody on the other side. And if that's the case, you need to respond to them because they have probably contradicted some of your views. They have probably said that some of the things that you think or believe are not true or are not good. So you're going to need to respond to them both to show your knowledge, to show that you've done your homework and you know what the other side says, but also this is another good way to be convincing. This is another good way to generate some claims and to then support those claims and to try to, win over your readers. So a lot of times we refer to this as a rebuttal. So you can basically respond to what your opponents have said. And it's sometimes helpful to summarize or even quote them. If you have a source that can help you to do that, that's very effective. And then you can tell us why your opponents are wrong and why you are right. So a rebuttal is really just a refutation or a contradiction of an opposing viewpoint or an opposing position. So that's what you're doing. And you can devote a body paragraph to this. You can do this maybe for a couple of body paragraphs. You can even do this on a claim by claim basis. So if you want to respond to a specific claim that one of your opponents made, you can build a body paragraph around that. You can introduce their claim, maybe briefly summarize it, explain it, show that you understand it, and then you can respond. So if you guys remember from a few weeks ago, we talked about the Rogerian argumentative style. If you remember that, what I'm saying right now might sound a little bit familiar, because this is kind of how we do the Rogerian style, if we want to use it. So remember, Rogers was this guy who claimed that most arguments go off the rails because the people arguing get angry at each other and they're not actually listening to each other's viewpoints. And they're not accurately, really, grasping each other's viewpoints. So what he said we should do is summarize the opposing viewpoint before we respond with our viewpoint. So we can use that strategy at times in our paper. Like I said a few weeks ago, the Rogerian approach works well if maybe you don't think of yourself as a super argumentative person, if you don't really love conflict, if you sort of like to find the middle ground with your opponents, you can do that. You can still kind of offer a rebuttal, but if you're sort of using the Rogerian style, your goal is to find kind of a compromise solution, some middle ground that can satisfy you and your opponent. Something that maybe you can both live with. Not everybody wants to do that. Like we were saying, a lot of people still prefer to think of arguing or an argumentative paper as like a war or like a sporting event where there can only be one winner and you are trying to defeat your opponent. You want to be right. You want them to be wrong. And it's that simple. If that works for you, fine. That's still how a lot of written arguments proceed, so that's fine. But if you're a little bit more compromise-minded, you can use the Rogerian. But either way, you need to respond to the other side. Whether you're trying to compromise with them or whether you're just trying to defeat them, either way, show us that you know what they're talking about. Show us that you understand it. Show us that you're willing to sort of hear them out before immediately jumping into your own claims and your own support. This doesn't only show knowledge, but it does do that. It also shows a certain degree of goodwill. It shows that you're even-tempered. You're not running too hot. You're not irrational. You're not letting your views or your emotions cloud your judgment. That's always good. That's a good impression to make on your readers. So responding effectively to the opponents, that's really good for your ethos. Keep that in mind. So plan at least one paragraph where you can do that, one body paragraph. You could even work it into your policy. Your policy itself could, in some ways, be in response to what your opponents are doing. Figure out how it works for you, right? Everybody will do this a little bit differently based on your topic, your argumentative style, your personality, the organization that you're using in the paper. It's always going to be a little different, but as we're drafting, we can start figuring out how we're going to do this. And then, go ahead and write the concluding paragraph. Sometimes we don't feel ready to do that in the rough draft because maybe we're not quite sure about the policy or we think we might add another body paragraph. I'm not quite 100% on that, fine. Again, none of this has to remain the exact same, right? We can make changes to anything that needs to be changed. So if the conclusion isn't great in the rough draft, we can always revise it later. But it's like everything else. You want to go ahead and write it. Again, we are striving for completion. Get everything written down in your rough draft. And once it's complete, we can look at what's there, we can evaluate it, and we can start making decisions about what needs to be revised, what needs to be cut, what do we need to add, and then, we'll edit as well. But that's what we do next week. So for this week, just try to be a writer. Just try to get into that flow state and produce a completed draft. I'm not going to give you guys full credit for the rough draft unless it is complete or very, very close to being complete. Okay? So a final note on the rough drafts as far as how I'm going to evaluate them. I want to make this clear because it has caused some confusion in the past. The rough draft is mostly a completion grade. Okay? So if you guys meet my minimum length and you're basically checking all the basic content boxes for this assignment, you will receive full credit. So if you look at the rough draft assignment, it's only worth 50 points. All right, so it's not a full essay in terms of point value. So if you turn it in on time and it's complete and it is at least somewhat coherent, I will give you full credit. But keep in mind, just because you got 50 out of 50 on the rough draft, that does not mean that you are in line to get a 100 on the final draft, okay? I'm not telling you by giving you full credit on the rough draft, I'm not telling you that everything's perfect. I'm not telling you, wow, you're ready to just turn this thing in. It's 50 out of 50. It is good to go. I don't mean that, okay? So don't pay so much attention to the score. Again, if you just complete it and get it turned in on time, you know the score is going to be 50 points. But read my comments, okay? My comments are more important than the point total. Look at the corrections I'm making on the document, okay? I will help you to start cleaning up I'll help you to start clean up some stuff. I'll help you to start the cleanup process, I think is how I'm trying to say that. I won't correct everything, but I'll make some corrections on the document, and I'll write some more extensive comments in the comment box that I hope you guys have noticed on previous assignments. Not always on research journals, but on any major essay, I always give you extensive feedback. That was true on the lit review. That was true on the bibliography. That will certainly be true on the rough draft and the final draft. So read my comments. That's where I'm really telling you what's working in the rough draft and what's not working. And I'm kind of giving you a revision plan for week 15. I'm telling you, here's what you need to do before you submit your final draft. For some of you, the revision plan might not be very long. For others, it might take a little bit more time. But I will be as specific and as clear as I possibly can be in my comments. So read my comments. You can notice the score, but don't get fixated on the score. What's more important are the comments, the revision plan. And after reading through all of that, if you have questions, if anything is unclear, email me. We can always do another video conference. We can always talk more about the paper. We can also just exchange emails if you simply have a question or two. But don't hesitate to reach out. I know some people think, instructors are really busy this time of the semester, and that's true. We are. But you guys are busy too. And part of my job is to help you guys. If you have questions, if you're struggling with your writing, I'm supposed to help. That's part of what I get paid for. So I'm never too busy to do that. Okay, it might take me the better part of 24 hours to get back to you if you emailed me. But if you haven't heard back within 24 hours, email me again. Okay, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And again, I'm willing to help as much as necessary. If that just means looking over multiple drafts, sending multiple emails, I'll do that. If that means another video conference where we can sit down and really go through a draft together, I'll do that. I'm pretty good at that. I can definitely help you guys out. So never hesitate to ask for help, ask for a question, or ask for a meeting. I can do all of the above. Of course, we'll have to, schedule it. We might not always find a time immediately, but I'm pretty flexible. I only have 2 weeks left of class, so we can always talk and work together more if you need it. All right, so good luck. I'll see those rough drafts soon, and as soon as I get them, I will provide feedback. So by early in week 15, or at least the middle of week 15, everybody will have their drafts returned. That means we'll start revising and editing. So that's what I'll talk about in next week's lecture, which will be the final lecture of the semester. And really consider next week to be the final week of the semester for us. So we are finishing up everything next week. So get in touch if you need anything. Otherwise, I will see you for one last lecture.